So a while back ago, I bought this. Yes, it's just a softbox, but from scraps. But didn't film some of the real processes. But no worries, I filmed the most important part. And beside that, it's a really simple build. So here's the idea: we have a regular light source which emits light in all directions. So to direct this light, we have an enclosure. But the enclosure wouldn't do much if it absorbs most of the light. So the inner part of the enclosure is covered with a reflective material. In that case, we'll just use regular aluminum foil. But the light you get from this setup is hard light. So to make this light softer, we place a translucent material in front of the light to scatter the light evenly, giving it a softer appearance. So in our case, we'll just use a translucent screen from an old laptop display. And that's pretty much it. So let's begin our build by sourcing a translucent screen from an old laptop LCD display.
So one screw at a time, I took up at the laptop's LCD display until I got to the translucent screen. But you see, the size of the translucent screen was going to determine the size of my softbox, meaning it was quite small. So you could use other translucent materials like maybe a clean thin white bedsheet or a thin light window blind. This gives you the flexibility of scaling up your softbox or scaling it down as you desire. But in my case, after sourcing the translucent screen, I then got its dimension, which was used to draw templates for the enclosure panels. The template were then transferred to some scrap pieces of polyurethane which I got from the installation of an old fridge, and the corresponding enclosure walls were cut out with a saw and sanded. But I would recommend you use cardboard and maybe cover it with some transparent tape. But if you must use foam, maybe you could use styrofoam, as standing polyurethane produces very fine dust particles which will be quite irritating and harmful. So after sanding the enclosure panels, I then checked to see that they all fitted. With that done, I then got a 0.4cm thick plywood from which the base will be cut from, which will act as a mounting point for the enclosure and the lamp. Template was then drawn on the plywood using dimensions of the base of the enclosure panels. The template is basically a rectangle with its length and width corresponding to that of the base of the enclosure panels, which will be cut later on in the video. Next, I had to figure out how the lamp would be mounted, which was a challenge as the light bulb I intended to use was taller than the enclosure panel was, giving no room for the translucent screen. The problem which could be solved by simply just increasing the height of the enclosure panel. Easier said than done, but I had an even more interesting solution to this. You see, most of these LED light bulbs simply consist of a PCB with surface mounted LEDs connected in series or in parallel, and mounted into a heatsink, which is basically just a sheet of aluminum. They could have either an inbuilt to an external SMP, that's a switch mode power supply, which converts mains AC current to the required DC voltage. This simply means we could separate the LED PCB from the case, giving it a smaller form factor, which could be mounted directly to the base of the enclosure, providing a good distance for proper diffusion or spread of light to the translucent screen. With that cleared, I then moved on to drill a hole at the center of the base from which 3 other holes were drilled, corresponding to the holes on the LED PCB. Using 3 screws, I then checked to ensure that the drilled holes correspond to or aligned with that on the LED PCB. But still yet, I noticed another problem. To mount other LED PCBs, they must have the same screw configuration as the original LED PCB. So after observing several LED PCB boards I had lying around, I noticed they usually come in either dual, tri, or quad arrangement. So to solve this, the idea was to cut 3 slots 150 degrees apart to accommodate bots with 3 holes of different sizes, and then for the bots with 2, 4 or 8 holes, this bots could simply be held in place with just 2 screws. So I simply just cut an extra slot adjacent to one of the 3 slots we cut earlier, and this simply just solves the problem. I then proceeded to cutting the 4 slots by first expanding the center hole to give way for my saw using some improvised tools since I had no drilling bit large enough. And with that done, all the LED PCBs I had lying around now fitted.
At this point, I'm sure you might be wondering why go through all this stress when you could just use regular 12-volt LED strips, for which I will say you're absolutely correct. As I know those far away safer, but since they come in 12 and 24-volt options, they are way easier to control as really available dimmer circuit boards for such LED strips. And I recommend you use them. But you see, this the strip Chinese lamps have a really short lifespan, and so we have a lot of them lying around, and the main purpose of this video was to repurpose them, as the main reason why they get bad is a broken or burnt out LED, which could be replaced by simply filling that gap with solder paste or simply just soldering. And also they could have a bad SMPS, that's a bad switching power supply, or simply just a power supply, for which you could simply just get one of these forms, a lamp whose PC board is completely burnt out. So that's it, and you could feel free to use your LED strips.
Okay, with that cleared, I then cut out the base of the enclosure followed by sanding it. It was now time to give the inner part of the enclosure panels a reflective finish, for which I grabbed myself a roll of aluminium foil paper and some shoe gum and moved on to cleaning the surfaces. Beginning with the base, I applied a thin layer of shoe gum. With the help of some labeling tape, I fixed one end of the aluminium foil paper onto an elevated surface and gently lowered it into the just applied gum on the plywood base. A tissue paper was then used to carefully rub the surface to make it smooth. And the excess aluminium foil paper cut with a pair of scissors. The same procedure was repeated with the rest of the 4 enclosure panels. Next step was to assemble the enclosure, for which I first cut the edges of the 4 enclosure panels to be inclined at a 45-degree angle. And then followed by sanding to ensure that they fitted properly. With the help of a drill and a pliers, I carefully pulled out some copper wires from an old coaxial cable I had lying around. These copper wires were then placed on the 4 joints of the enclosure panels alongside the shoe gum, reason for which will be seen later in the video, even though it contributes to reinforcing the enclosure.
So while the gum set, it was now time to prepare the base by cutting some 45-degree angled lines on each of the 4 corners of the base, which were later on cut into slots out of camera.
Okay, so remember how I earlier said some parts of the video weren't filmed. So if you look closely, you notice I already attached an attachment point, which is basically just a block of wood and then with a bolt. This will be used to attach it to our stand. And then that brings us to how the base was attached to the enclosure. So remember the copper wires we inserted on the 4 corners.
Well, the protruding end of the 4 copper wires were simply inserted into the 4 slots on the base, which we cut out of camera. And to hold everything in place, the 4 copper wires were then bent against the base of the enclosure panel. So after trimming the front part of the enclosure, it was now time to create 2 frames from some pieces of wood which will help hold the translucent screen. And if you notice, I already made and attached one of such frames around the perimeter of the frontal part of the enclosure. And the second frame which will hold the translucent screen was made in the same way with some pieces of plywood as follows. So grooves were then cut on the 2 ends of each of the 4 strips to ensure that they sit flush when glued later on with super glue. I then marked and drilled 4 holes for the mounting screws. The 4 holes were then mirrored on the translucent screen and the support screen. And then the same procedure was repeated on the frame at the frontal perimeter of the enclosure. It was now time to put everything together, beginning with the support screen, the translucent screen, the frame, and finally 4 screws to hold the screen in place. With the power cord already attached, it was now time to try it out.
But sadly, so you see these translucent screens we got from the old laptop display was sort of flimsy, so I used this other screen I got from the same laptop LCD display to kind of support it. But I noticed the second screen was sort of modifying the light in ways we didn't expect and also absorbing lots of the light, meaning we're getting very poor or strange lighting with also really low intensity, giving our poor or giving our low powered LED lamps. So to solve this, I noticed this box you often get sneakers from are sort of translucent. So the idea is to replace this with this by simply just attaching this up to the original frame. And I think this will solve the problem. So let's move on to that.
So the idea is to cut the back open, use some super glue to attach it to the frame, trim the excess, and then finally use some labeling tape to cover the rough edges as follows. Okay, it's now time to feed the screws and mount the light box. And that's it. Yes, it's not the brightest, but it works, and you can always replace the lamp with brighter and higher CRI value lights and definitely make it bigger.
Okay, so just as a bonus, here's our light stand, which is basically just made from 2 pieces of scrap bolts put together, and then our base is basically just the stand of an desktop monitor. And that is just it. And then our softbox simply mounts onto this with the attachment points here and area and top on. So the board is simply inserted to the pole on the stand. Then with the help of another of the bolt, we just fasten it.
Then
And that's pretty much it.
okay, at this point, I'm sure you've already realized this video wasn't intended to be like the most professional or extreme filming like, but rather to be something to design out of things I had lying around. But if you want something a little bit extreme, I think you should check out DIY Petos. I think he has like the best videos on lighting I've seen so far. So I'll leave a link to his playlist. And if you want to see me build a vacuum cleaner from a blender small to you know what to do. So that's been it for this one. Stay on.
Just as a quick note, this video was originally filmed in August and September of 2022, but sadly, most of the original footages were lost following a Trojan attack on my hard drive, so the footages used here were simply low resolution test edits I backed up on my main PC.